precocious puberty, which then can set someone up for future cancers. So I think actually the high protein diet might be the worst thing that you could feed children. They need adequate protein, but like you always say, Howard, protein's so important that it's present in everything we eat. And if you just eat a nice, varied, plant-based diet, you'll get enough protein. So for my kids, I never push protein. I never tell them to eat protein. I tell them to eat, vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds and beans. And as much as I could get them to eat that is as much as they'll be getting the healthy protein.
Awesome. Thanks. So let's see if, let's bring in Bhavna.
I think some people are just joining. I think, can you guys send a message if you have a question through the send a message part?
Yeah, I have people, it says that they're calling in.
Yeah, well, here's, I think they're calling in just to be on the show. So Vegan Gosling wrote, why is dairy not good for us, even if we are not lactose intolerant? Which is a good question. Let me see. Can we bring in Vegan Gosling?
Not sure how. If they call in, we can.
Okay, you have to. I guess you have to. How do you actually call in if you have a question?
I think.
Sorry, guys, this is our first time
the
doing
same way you do. People will see the circle that says "call in," and then they can call in.
So if you have a question, you could push the call in button. Otherwise, you could just watch, I guess.
Yeah, you can just type. You can type it on the side. So here they're starting to come in now. So what about dairy? Even if we can do lactose, fine. What's the problem with it?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And the data goes back and forth. So there's some data that shows that dairy's okay for you, some that it's bad. I will tell you that most of the data that shows that dairy is good for you comes from the Dairy Association. In fact, I'm not sure I've seen a pro-dairy article that didn't have dairy funding. But part of the problem, they did a great study where they looked at they took a group of people and they gave them either water or juice or cream. And they looked at inflammatory mediators. And what they found is there was like a substantial inflammation with cream, but not with juice or with water. And what we are finding is that dairy, mainly high-fat dairy, but dairy creates inflammation, does stimulate IGF-1, which we know has been related with cancer. And dairy is very strongly associated with prostate cancer. And so I think that dairy, like any animal protein, is associated with certain cancers. But if you're eating if you're drinking low-fat dairy, it's not going to be as bad. It tends to be the saturated fat that tends to be one of the worst parts about it.
All right. So while we're talking about fat, Holdify wants to know: is there a certain percentage, grams or percentage of fat that you recommend in a plant-based diet? This is all over the place, right? From down to 10% up to 20%, and we hear about necessary fats.
Yeah, and this is back to when people always ask me. I was on an interview today where they were asking, well, how much protein do I need to eat, or how much fat do I need to eat? And I guess I've started getting to this point, and your book Whole goes over this quite a bit, but I've gotten to this point where I don't want to talk about protein or fat, or I just want to talk about whole foods. So if you're asking me, should I eat an avocado every day? Yeah, hell yeah. Should I eat a handful of nuts? Yeah. How much fruits and vegetables should I get? That's the questions we should be asking, not how much protein or how much fat. So, the answer is hard to say how much fat. I mean, it depends where your fat's sourced and what it's coming from. I've been pretty impressed with the lower fat diets and their effect over time, but I think that's mainly the lower animal protein diets too. I don't think there's anything wrong with the fats from an avocado or some nuts, except that they can be a little bit calorie dense, so you got to watch overdoing that.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I remember in reading the very beginning of the manuscript when we started working together, like you said, I'm kind of having to hold my nose to write this book because I have to be so reductionist about it.
Yeah. I mean, I did the book to try to get away from reductionism and show how bad it is to say that, you should eat protein. And that's so reductionist. I mean, you should eat food, real food. The problem is, by writing a book called Proteinaholic, you've immersed yourself in this battle macronutrients. This is just ridiculous. I mean, our ancient ancestors weren't worried about how much protein they were getting. They were worried about what food they were getting. And for our future, I think it's going to be hugely important how much whole foods we're getting, not how much protein.
Right. So someone writes, Garth, huge fan. How do you feel about coffee?
I'm actually okay with coffee. Coffee actually, there's actually some good data with coffee in longevity studies. It is high in antioxidants. It does have chlorogenic acid, so it's a little bit acidic. So, if you balance that with fruits and vegetables, that's fine. I have, funny what happened with me is I wasn't a big coffee drinker, and I went out to eat once, and they had French press coffee. And this was the greatest thing I had ever had, this French press coffee. So I bought a French press. I started drinking a lot of coffee, and I check my labs constantly because I'm constantly experimenting with myself. And my LDL levels started to go up. And it turns out that French press coffee, the actual coffee bean has a certain oil in it that can increase LDL cholesterol, which is your bad cholesterol. And in fact, it was doing that with me. And I switched to filtered coffee, just regular old filtered coffee, and my LDL went back. And so for certain people, especially me, I'm very prone to having high cholesterol. And certain people, cholesterol can actually increase your LDL, but otherwise I think it's okay.
Gotcha. So you posted, I think today on Facebook about how much you're loving the latest Rich Roll podcasts with Ray Cronise. So we have a question about what's your views on intermittent fasting or calorie restriction on a whole food plant-based diet?
Yeah, I've been studying this quite a bit lately. I've been very into the intermittent fasting idea. Now, I've also tried it a few times. I just can't do it. I've just set my body. I'm such I eat so many carbs. And when you eat carbs, and lots of carbs, you definitely need to have a fairly consistent carb intake during the day to keep your energy levels up. In other words, I'm not fat adapted. I'm not burning fat for fuel. I'm using mainly carbs. And so for me to fast is very difficult. The intermittent fasting data has looked really good so far. I mean, it does appear that you can lose weight successfully with it, and you could do it without the expense of losing muscle, but it's extremely difficult to do. I would much rather eat a very high fruit and vegetable diet and never be hungry rather than putting myself through this torture. The longevity data, intermittent fasting, a lot of it came from the longevity data where they were noticed when they took rhesus monkeys that if you fast, then they tended to live longer. But the new thought on that is not necessarily that it's the calorie deficit that's important, but rather the deficit in certain amino acids that we think contribute to aging. And so in the sports world, the big thing is leucine. You need your leucine. There's leucine supplements and branch chain amino acid supplements, and leucine's a branch chain amino acid. And it might be that while leucine does cause you to build muscle, it actually might make you age and actually cause cancer. It activates a pathway called the mTOR, and we talk about that in the book, as you know, Howard, and that might be bad for you. And so I feel like on a whole food plant-based diet, you're not getting a lot of leucine. So you're getting the benefits of the fast without actually fasting. Gotcha.
So someone wants to know, what are the most important things to check when getting your blood work done? So you say you're always doing your own, you're always checking. What for the layperson, what's an important test, and what do the numbers mean?
Sure. And I see that Monty there above that said, what are my cholesterol numbers? So my cholesterol numbers, my LDL, I can't remember my first LDL. It was really high. It was so high that I was like, okay, I'm barely going to even look at that. And then I ran and got a CAT scan on my heart to make sure I didn't have, I think it was like 190 or something like that. We're talking a pretty high LDL number. Over the years, I've got this great graph of it continuously going down. The lowest I got it to was 102. Which, preferably you want it below 100. I don't take any statins or anything. I did that all with diet. But my 102, I'm pretty happy with. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get a heart attack with that. But I do have a family history of heart disease and high cholesterol. So, cholesterol is kind of a weird thing. Certain people don't have a susceptibility to saturated fat, and saturated fat will raise your cholesterol no matter how good you are, what your cholesterol numbers are. In certain people, it's going to raise it way too much, and they're going to have a baseline starting high level. That's me. So that's why I've got to watch out for the oils and coffee and saturated fats and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Great. So
and then back to what labs?
Yeah.
I typically check vitamin D. there's been a lot of data on vitamin D lately. A lot of people are very deficient on it. Some people think we're over worrying about it, and that might be true, but I've certainly seen in my patients low vitamin D levels that contribute to what we find is actually bone disorder, where you're actually eating your own bone because you have such a low vitamin D level that your body can't absorb calcium, and your body goes to start leaching off of its bone, and that could cause osteoporosis. And so I do follow vitamin D levels in myself and in my patients regularly. I think if you're a true vegan, I mean, you're really not eating any animal products whatsoever, you ought to check your B12 levels and make sure they're okay. Mine are always fine, and I really, though we categorically have to tell you to supplement with B12, my levels are always good, and my supplementation is, I do it once a week when I remember, and I often forget, but my last value was 500, so that's pretty good. Of course, that depends on when I took it. I'll typically check a complete blood cell count on my patients, and liver function tests and lipid studies and iron studies. These are just typical studies that I'll do.
Great. So Loves New England says, I'm a post-op RNY patient. Do you give the plant-based diet for your current patients? My surgeon follows the high protein diet. I'm losing weight with the plant-based diet. So a lot of people have been asking over, I just had the bariatric surgery. What should I eat?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. It's absolutely fine to go on a plant-based diet. You got to understand, and I hate to say this, but bariatric surgeons have very little training on nutrition. And this concept of a high protein diet was kind of invented in this bariatric world, basically following lay media and lay diets. And so we hear about Atkins working, and so therefore they think, okay, with my patients, I'm going to put them on. And there's also this idea that with a gastric bypass, you're on a pretty low-calorie diet. So if you're on a low-calorie diet, taking in a lot of protein does seem to preserve muscle mass. However, in actuality, part of the reason I switched to a plant-based diet was finding that when I was, my first book, as you know, Howard, but some of the followers on here might not know, when I first started doing bariatrics, I was very pro-protein. And I was telling everybody to eat high-protein diet. And I was seeing problems with them, not in the first year, but after the first year, where they were starting to get weight regain, and they were starting to get high cholesterol, and their hypertension was coming back, and their diabetes was coming back. And at the same time, my cholesterol level was high. And as I started studying nutrition more and more, I started thinking to myself, my God, it's the high protein, just like what our whole book's about. And so I have got lots of bariatric patients that follow a plant-based diet, some of them vegan, some of them just plant-based. I'd say all of my patients eat a lot more fruits and vegetables than they ever ate before. And then a few of them are eating some meat, but the vast majority of them have really been able to change their diet to a predominantly plant-based diet.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if you see any sort of dose response line with, the question, how plant-based do you need to go? Like, is 100% a lot better than 99.5%, or, is 50%?
Yeah, we talked about this, right? But when we were writing the book, if you look at the data, I tend to feel that the more plant-based you are, the better off you are. I mean, what we're talking about is trying to decrease inflammation in the body, which we know plants do, and we know that meat does the opposite. I do think that fish may be the exception. If you look at the recent, you know how much I love the Seventh-day Adventist studies, because they're really good studies. We're talking many years following patients with a really good, the problem with a lot of studies is we don't have a very good difference. Like if you just look at the American public, there's not a big difference in how much fat and how much protein. Everyone eats pretty much the same. But in the Adventist health, there's people that were like purely vegan, and there's people that were vegetarian, people that are pescatarian. And in the most recent study, when they're looking at colon cancer, boy, the pescatarians did better than the vegans, which is kind of surprising. And I've seen that we also saw that in the Oxford EPIC study. And so I think fish may be an exception to that. I don't eat fish. It may be that the part of fish that really may be beneficial to us may be the omega-3s. There's been a lot of debate back and forth. Does supplementing with omega-3 really help? I have begun to at times supplement, though, again, I'm really bad with supplements, to supplement with microalgae omega-3. There may be some benefit. I think probably the answer is not so much supplementing with omega-3, but eating a less omega-6. In other words, eating less, oils and things like that. Because if you're vegan, but you're eating a lot of processed vegan food and you're eating a lot of vegetable oils, and fried, tofu and things like that, you're going to eat a lot of omega-6 and not a lot of omega-3. And that seems to be what creates inflammation. And so, how plant-based to get, we're never going to be able to answer that question, but I think the more the merrier.
Right. Because, I kind of feel like psychologically the answer should be 95% is like good enough for most people. But we kept coming across studies that suggested that the biggest benefit was the last inch.
It's exactly true. The biggest benefit seems to be in that last little bit where you go. And for me, going from vegetarian to vegan was a big change. It really helped my cholesterol levels tremendously and my fitness level. And I think that cheese was really getting me. That cheese is, high in saturated fat and not good for you. But I kept, I didn't want to give up my pizza. Now I still have pizza. It just doesn't have cheese on it and still tastes pretty good.
Right. So there's a couple of questions coming in about exhaustion. So someone says, I've been plant-based for almost 3 years. I'm becoming more exhausted by the week. Someone wants to know about the pitfalls of plant-based diet and worrying about too much copper and too little zinc can make you tired. Do you see that? And I see it in some people where they say, I've just gone plant-based and now I'm tired. Okay.
So one thing I do see is everybody complaining that they're tired. Every human being. I mean, there's not a patient that doesn't come through my door that isn't. If I stop that, do you feel tired? I don't even ask that question anymore. I just assume everyone's feeling tired. Meat eaters are feeling tired. Everyone's feeling tired. We live in stressful worlds. We don't exercise enough. I think we don't get near. There's a lot of really good studies lately on circadian rhythm and the fact that we don't get enough sleep. We get too much blue light screen time in front of computers like we're doing right now and in front of our phones and things like that. And that could really mess up our sleep patterns, and that creates a lot of tiredness. I have found in general, when I switch people to a plant-based diet, they tend to do much, much better as far as energy level because our bodies love processing carbs. And in fact, the big mistake I see people make is switching to a plant-based diet, but not eating enough. So they're still in this mentality of calorie restriction. So they're calorie restricting and they're switching to a plant-based diet. So they're getting less calories just by, switching to a plant-based diet, and they're having portion control. Like, I'm going to have this tiny little salad, and they're not getting enough calories. And that could definitely make you feel tired. I have not seen a problem. In fact, quite the opposite. I usually see really good zinc levels. In my meat eaters, I see terrible zinc levels. In my gastric bypass patients, I see terrible zinc levels. But in people that are eating a good plant-based diet, they usually have good zinc levels. I think you might get in a problem with people that are really following like Dr. McDougall and some of these guys that are no nuts, and Dr. Esselstyn, no nuts, no seeds, no oils at all. You'll sometimes see a deficit of zinc. Now, I like to get some cocoa, because it's really high in antioxidants, loaded magnesium and zinc. I get a lot of nuts and seeds, love pumpkin seeds. So I've never had a problem with zinc and magnesium myself.
Gotcha. Great. So someone's asking about leaky gut. Are there theories on how it develops and how to get rid of it?
Yeah, funny thing about I see all this leaky gut stuff, and so much of it is nonsense out there. This functional medicine view of leaky gut is completely wrong. This idea that carbs cause leaky gut, hell no. There's zero evidence for that. That gluten causes leaky gut, not unless you have celiac disease. Gluten does not cause leaky gut. There have been studies that show a leak. I don't even, the term leaky gut, we used it in medicine to connotate a translocation of bacteria from inside the intestine into your bloodstream. What we are finding, and that usually happens in really, really sick patients. That's not going to happen in your average person walking around, although there's questions about that. What we have found is that if you eat saturated fat with meat, you could get the situation where it's called the gap junctions, but the connections between the different cells inside lining your intestines can get a little bit of a separation. And what seems to get through there is endotoxin. Now, what endotoxin is it's a product of bacteria. And endotoxin, if it gets into your blood system, so, meat has bacteria in it, but we cook it to kill the meat, right? But that endotoxin stays even with the cooking process. And when that's absorbed into your body, that can create inflammation. I talk about that quite a bit in the book. And so there may be some truth to that. There was another question on here about microbiome. A microbiome is so infinitely important. And even with obesity, there's this great story recently. They've started to do fecal transplants. They call them fecal transplants, where they will give the stool of one person to another. It can be in the form of an enema or of a pill. And we've been doing it for a bacteria called C. diff, which is a really bad bacteria, and it's becoming resistant to antibiotics. And C. diff, when it becomes resistant to antibiotics, if you put good bacteria in, the good bacteria tends to fight it and do really well with it. So an interesting thing happened. This lady had C. diff. She needed a fecal transplant. Her daughter-in-law gave her the fecal transplant. So they took her daughter-in-law's feces, spun it down, made capsules, gave it to the woman, and her C. diff went away. But here's the catch. Her daughter-in-law was morbidly obese. The lady who had C. diff has always been skinny. 5 months after the fecal transplant, morbidly obese. And that's an N of one, so that's not a scientific study, but there's at Harvard, they've actually been studying gastric bypass. And they're trying to figure out why gastric bypass works long-term. Because they tend to find that the restriction we get, so you can't eat as much, tends to go away a bit over time. People can eat more. And the hormones that control hunger with a gastric bypass tend to go away after a year or two. But long-term success with a gastric bypass is pretty strong. And they're starting to find out that possibly that long-term success may be a change in the microbiome that happens with the weight loss surgery. But I think microbiome, that we have more bacteria in us than we have human cells. And I think the way we foster that bacteria is going to make a huge difference in our health. And I talk about that a bit in the book, but certainly good bacteria is going to be absolutely crucial to preventing inflammation, to controlling cancers, to controlling weight.
All right, thanks. So, so the question of probiotics. So, I know for myself, I was dealt 2 negative strikes in that I was cesarean section and bottle fed. And, I just heard about a study where they're taking babies who are being born, and vaginal swabbing and just kind of wiping the bacteria on them. What's your take on probiotics? For those of us who didn't get the chance at the first time around.
I think probiotics are good. I think probably what's more important than probiotics is prebiotics. In other words, you can take all the probiotics you want, but if you don't feed that good bacteria the right food, or if you feed it the wrong food, you're just going to wipe it out. And so people take probiotics and then they go and eat a steak. Well, if you remember in the book, I talk about that study from Nature by Dr. David, where they looked at meat eaters versus plant-based eaters and how it changed their microbiome. And within just days, you could take a vegetarian and just give them a few meals of meat, and they've totally, completely changed their microbiome. So I think the way you eat is going to be probably more important than whether or not you take probiotics. But I do think probiotics are a good idea if you're having problems. If you're having irritable bowel syndrome, if you're having weight issues, there have been some studies, at least with weight loss surgery patients, there were some really good studies that taking probiotics helps keep the weight off. If you're totally fine, feel great, not having any problems, I don't think you need to take probiotics. It probably means you got a good microbiome.
Great. So someone wants to know, they're trying to go plant-based, but they're struggling with giving up sugar. So is this a common problem that you see in your clinic?
Well, I mean, it's hard to get rid of sugar. Everyone has a hard problem with sugar because we eat so much sugar. I think the key in that situation, first of all, is a high fiber diet, because what a high fiber diet does, a good plant-based diet, keeps your blood sugars very, very stable. And one thing that's going to make you want sugar is if you eat sugar and you get a sugar spike and then you get a sugar drop as their insulin levels rise, as that sugar is coming down, man, I want more sugar. And so you want to stay away from these fluxes. So one way to do that, you got to go cold turkey off of added sugar. You got to go cold turkey. You got to sweat it out like a cocaine addict, and it's hard to do. Once you've sweated it out, it becomes a lot easier. The second thing is fruit. Like when I want sweets, I'll reach for fruit. A handful of blueberries with maybe a sprinkling of cocoa on them, or berries or an apple, something like that is a really good, because it will give you some sugars, but it's a nice slow release because of the fiber with it, and it tends to control sweets cravings really well. The other thing that works really well is really super dark chocolate, because dark chocolate tends to give your body that serotonin rise that a lot of people are looking for, and the bitterness kind of takes away that want for sugar.
So do you find that when people sweat it out and go cold turkey and kind of lose, they lose the biological need for sugar, that they can come back and have a piece of cake every once in a while? Or does just having one, is it different for different people, that, they're back off the wagon?
Right. It just depends on how insulin sensitive you are. I from time to time, I'll have sweets. My daughter had a birthday party the other day and she had a cake. I had a small piece of cake. It tasted good, but now I've kind of, what happens over a while, you develop, your palate changes, right? Like, it's just too super sweet to me. Like, if you avoid sweets, it becomes too super sweet. And a lot of my patients talk about that, like food that they used to like, just, it's too super sweet to them. And when you start getting, there was this fantastic, really interesting study, I thought, where they took people that were overweight and they did functional MRI studies of their brain. And they showed them foods that they would typically want to eat, and their brain would light up like, oh, you're showing me a cake. Oh my God, I want to eat a cake right now. And then they would show them like a salad, and their brain was like, meh, who wants a salad? But then they did something called cognitive behavioral therapy. And I do this with my patients. Like, I'll do things like aversion therapy, where I'll say, take a picture of the food that you typically eat, and like, your ice creams and your cakes and your cheeseburgers, and surround that from a picture of yourself that you do not like, and put that collage up, and look at it every day. So that both consciously and subconsciously, you're seeing, this food that you typically eat, that you associate it with comfort because you've always eaten it in times of comfort, and you've got good feelings towards it because you're hungry. It makes you feel good. Oh my God, that steak looks incredible, or that cake looks incredible. But now you're like, wait a second, that steak and cake makes me feel bad, makes me look like this. And on the flip side, take a picture of, what you want, like what your goals are, someone crossing a finish line, whatever it is, and then surround that by pictures of fruits and vegetables and salads. And they did this with these patients. They brought them back 6 weeks later, and they did the functional MRI. Now they showed them the cheeseburgers and the cakes, and the brain didn't light up like it did before. But show them a salad, all of a sudden it's lighting up. My point being here that you could actually change your brain, which I've really done. Like, when I look at a junk food, it no longer has that same draw to me, because I think, how am I going to feel after I eat that? How's it going to make me feel? Is it worth it? Is that bite worth it? And I'll do a bite just to make myself feel, like, okay, I had a bite. This isn't horrible. But my general craving for these things has decreased tremendously. And I see that happening with my patients too.
Gotcha. So there's a question about detoxing. What are your thoughts? It's a very hot kind of, diet trend.
Because you could sell all kinds of stuff. Take this pill for detoxing. Look, it turns out that our bodies are absolutely fantastic at detoxing themselves. And if you want to detox, stop eating toxic stuff. So stop with the processed carbs, and stop with the meat, and stop with the dairy. And if you stop those things, your body's going to detox naturally. You don't have to fast. There's some pretty good data with fasting, like we talked about. So if you wanted to do a day fast or a 2-day fast, there may be some benefit with that. I can't say that there's definitely benefit, but there may be. But aside from that, if you just eat a high fruit and vegetable, high fiber diet, fiber is the key detoxer. Fiber is what binds toxins and which clears out your system. And so if anything, fasting is probably not the best detoxer. Probably the best detoxer is eating a whole bunch of fiber.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So I think as a man writes in, he's going to be 50 next year. Do you recommend FOBT, colonoscopy, or sigmoidoscopy?
I think probably right now colonoscopy. I would go with colonoscopy. I think colonoscopy is the best screening tool. There's a sigmoidoscopy. I don't really think sigmoidoscopy should be a screening tool, because that's going to miss right side colon lesion. So if you're going to subject yourself to a procedure, you might as well get your whole colon checked. There are some, new things that they're trying now with CAT scans and non-invasive, but as far as I know, I would go a colonoscopy right now, but check with your GI doctor.
Mm-hmm. And would you recommend that sort of across the board, or for folks at higher risk?
I think across the board, it's probably a good idea at age 50 to get a colonoscopy. Okay. If you've got risk factors, it needs to be earlier. It depends what your risk factors are, of course.
Okay. A question about depression. So someone was talking about having students in college age who have depressive symptoms as well as GI symptoms. And is there a discussion to be had with diet and depression?
Yeah, there's definitely, yes, without a doubt. I mean, there's been a lot of studies on diet and depression, and they do tend to figure together. It's not the end-all be-all cure, so it's not like, going on a plant-based diet guarantees happiness, because going on a plant-based diet doesn't change your job and your work and your bank account and all that kind of stuff. And there are physiologic, obviously, things that cause depression, and you can address some of those things with plants, but sometimes it's not enough. So I don't think a diet, if you're seriously depressed, I think a diet's an important part of a comprehensive treatment for depression.
Great. Allison wonders, once you're a type 2 diabetic, are you always considered a diabetic, even when you have it controlled with diet and exercise?
That's a good question. We get into these debates quite a bit. Because for research purposes, what constitutes a cure? So if I say gastric bypass cures diabetes, what constitutes a cure? Is a low A1C level a cure? Well, I'll tell you, there's been some studies with paleo diet. You go on a paleo diet or one of these low carb diets, your blood sugars are going to get better. But does that mean you're not diabetic? Well, diabetes is not, by definition, is not to me having high blood sugar. And we're talking about type 2 diabetes here specifically. But the disease process with type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. So you get high insulin levels trying to get the blood sugar into your cells. The problem is that your cells won't take in the sugar. And so these people that are on really high fat, high protein diets, their blood sugars drop and their A1C level drops. But their insulin sensitivity does not improve, or at least in this one study. When they did the MRIs, they found that they still had intramyocellular fat, meaning the muscle cells still had fat in them, because we know certain proteins and fat make your cells hold on to fat. And when there's fat inside those cells, those muscle cells, the muscle cells can't produce insulin receptors. You can't produce insulin receptors, you get insulin resistant. So my answer would be, if you're on a high protein, high carb diet and you still have intramyocellular fat, well, you still have type 2 diabetes, and you're fixing it by not eating sugar so that you're not getting high sugars. Well, let's say you're patching it, putting a Band-Aid on it, and that might be effective, but it's not as effective as getting the fat out of those muscle cells and truly becoming insulin sensitive again. If you're insulin sensitive, in other words, your intramyocellular fat is low, your insulin levels are normal, and your response to a glucose tolerance test, in other words, if I give you sugar, your body responds normally, that's a cure for diabetes.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Grace wants to know, says, my spouse has had IBS for 10 years, and starting a vegan diet helped some, but since she started to feed him naturally fermented food daily, the IBS symptoms are 99% gone. Have you heard of this?
Absolutely. Tons of this. This is very common. We talked about taking probiotics before. The best probiotic you possibly take is sauerkraut. So going back to this whole foods versus processed foods, fermented foods are extremely good for the GI system. And I've seen a lot of benefit in people that have switched to fermented foods and a whole plant-based diet. So the diet went vegan, so you're giving the bacteria good bacteria, but then he needed some of that good bacteria that he got with the fermented foods, and that combination together cured his IBS, and that is a very, very common finding.
Gotcha. Looking for other questions. I don't see any coming in. So if anyone has a question, here's one.
I see a few of them here. Let's see. I was fat and sick 1.5 years ago, switched to a plant-based diet to prove to my peers at 51 years old you can reverse disease through whole food nutrition. I'm running a 51K ultra in a month. My question is about athletic performance. How do you eat before triathlon and the the day of the event? I get this question a lot too. I tend to, one thing I've really struggled with and what I really wanted to do is eat the same way every day that I would at all times. I don't really, with athletics, we've gotten this concept now, periodization, which is, you prepare yourself for this event and you're healthiest and in your best shape right at that event. And then everything goes south for a while and you build it back up. And I'm trying to keep a very steady level of health. And so I don't vary my diet much. Now, if you're a really competitive runner, I would tell you there's been some studies that, fat adapting by going on an all fat diet, which sounds absolutely disgusting to me, but going on a very high fat diet and totally wiping out your glycogen and then going on a really high carb diet and carb loading increases your glycogen storage, which is supposed to increase your performance. But why go through all of that? Why go through that hell? I just eat a predominantly carbohydrate based, high fruit, high vegetable diet. The day of my race, I will typically do oatmeal and berries, or maybe some almond butter on some whole grain toast. During the race, if it's a long race, if it's a short race, I don't take anything. If it's a really long race, like a marathon or an Ironman, I do use goo packets and honey and pickle juice and beets and this kind of stuff.
Right. And one of the things that we've seen is there's all these studies coming out of sports physiology programs that are really talking about extreme athletes, and they're being presented in the media like they're advice for all of us. Right. There was just that article in the New York Times that you wrote about.
Yeah. It's the worst thing you could do. And there's a lot of the guys that are doing the high fat adapting diets. All their studies are being done on athletes, and they're then kind of selling that to the public. And I can't tell you the difference. It's just a world of difference between your average American and a high level athlete. There's a whole different physiology. So they did a really good MRI study. I like to harp on intracellular fat because it's such an important indicator of disease. But they found in really trained athletes, while they do have intracellular fat, they tend to mobilize it really easily, whereas the average person can't mobilize it. So there's a huge difference in physiology, and trying to copy what Arnold Schwarzenegger is doing or a Tour de France cyclist is doing is a really bad idea in the average person.
Gotcha.
And I'll tell you, one thing I see daily, funny enough, I saw 3 today, which makes me think about it. I see a lot of college-level athletes in my practice that are now seeing me for obesity and high cholesterol and hypertension. And a lot of these diets, as we talk about what they were put on when they were younger, really destroys their system. These really high-protein diets that they followed most of their life, as soon as they stop doing the athletic part of it, it really catches up with them.
Gotcha. So someone wants to know that the debate about medical cannabis and anecdotal evidence that could help Crohn's and other gut problems. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No thoughts on that. I don't know much about that.
Okay. And also, what's your marathon PR?
3:35, but I'm pretty sure I've got a 3:25 in me right now. So that's what I'll be going for next, 3:25.
Awesome. So you're 25 minutes away from Boston?
3:25 is my Boston, my BQ. That's what I need to qualify. So 10 minutes away.
Okay, cool. Someone says, I have a hard time losing weight. I broke my metabolism about 8 years ago. The vegan diet didn't help with weight loss. My RMR is 1022 at age 53. BMI is about 30. What are my options?
Yeah, 1022 is a pretty low metabolic rate. Number one, I would increase activity. 10,000 steps a day, 30 minutes, 5 days a week of heavy activity. I would switch up that activity where some of it is aerobic activity, where you are staying at 180 minus your age for 30 minutes straight, keeping at that level. I would probably start doing fasted cardio when I was doing that slow cardio, keeping your heart rate at less than 180 minus your age, to try to build up fat burning. Then I would also do high intensity interval training to try to increase the mitochondria in the muscles, which has been shown to increase metabolism. And this is a situation, if I get with people really low metabolism, I mean, I still love the plant-based diet. I don't like the term vegan because I don't know what that means. I mean, were you on a vegan diet eating Oreos? because, you know, it ain't going to work. A high plant-based diet, lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, lots of beans, low fat, the only fat coming from a handful of nuts a day and some avocados. That kind of diet seems to always work. So a lot of people say they're on a vegan diet, but they're really not eating plants. They're eating a lot of the processed foods. And obviously that's not gonna cut it. I really try to get people to drop down oil because oil is so calorie dense. So that person has such a low metabolic rate that they really need to lower their calorie intake, and oils are going to get in the way. And I got to say, in these kind of extreme situations, I'm impressed with the intermittent fasting. And some of the intermittent fasting protocols, such as eating only in a certain 8-hour time span. So for instance, you know, waking up, not eating, maybe a cup of coffee or some tea in the morning, drinking some water, and then having lunch at 1 o'clock, eating, you know, a decent sized meal, 500 calories or so, lots of fruits, lots of vegetables and beans and stuff like that. And then having dinner maybe at about 6 o'clock, and then not eating again until 1 o'clock. Those kind of, the idea behind these intermittent fasting is that it doesn't seem to cause you to waste muscle. But it does seem to lead to more fat burning over time because you're in a fast for a longer period of time. You get some of that glycogen depletion, which causes you to start burning more fat for calories. It's still being studied, but that's the kind of situation where if everything else fails, I'd start looking at these more extreme measures. And then some of the guys right now, like I was just listening, and I talk sometimes on Facebook, I was just listening to Ray Kronice's stuff on he's a really interesting guy who has really thinking outside the box with weight loss. And and this is growing, but this idea of being cold every day, like freezing yourself, like jumping in a cold pool, 75 degrees, they say, to stimulate some brown fat and shivering response and stuff. I mean, this is more extreme stuff. I don't do this with my patients, but it's things to look at.
Yeah, well, my martial arts teacher is trying to get me to pour 5 gallons of ice water over my head every day. So. Yeah,
I hate cold. So I've never gotten into this doing the cold. Just like I can't do the fasting, I can't do the cold. I respect these people that do, but I just can't do it.
Okay. So there's a question from JP Barry North about the oil, that noting that we're recommending a whole food plant-based diet, and some of the recipes in the book do have oil in them. So what's your, is it better to be without oil, or can people tolerate small amounts?
Well, again, everyone's different. Some people could tolerate, some can't. Oil is extremely calorie dense. So if you have like that patient with that person with the low resting metabolic rate of 1,000 calories, oil's not a good idea. It's just too calorie dense for their metabolic rate. From a heart disease standpoint, there's studies all over the place. The recent data looks pretty good that monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fat is probably okay for your heart. If you take saturated fat and replace it with monounsaturated fat, your risk of heart disease goes down. What those studies didn't do is take people with saturated fat and then take out all fat from their diet and look at it. And we know from looking at Dr. Ornish and Dr. Esselstyn's work that if you've got heart disease, extremely low-fat diets seem to do fantastic for reversing heart disease. So I think, and Ornish wrote about this, but there's a spectrum. If you're a fairly healthy person, but you want to lose a little bit of weight, for everybody, I think cutting back on oil is a good idea. We eat too much of it, but having some oil is not going to kill you. But I just wouldn't make it saturated fat.
Great. So what's your take on nutrient deficiencies that are common after bariatric surgery? Iron, calcium, vitamin D, protein, B12.
We see these problems. We see it in meat eaters. We see it I don't see it so much in my plant-based eaters, probably because my plant-based eaters tend to be more compliant in general, and they're eating a little bit better. With gastric bypass, you may need a B12 supplement. You may not. Some people do, some people don't. I see some zinc deficiency in some people. Typically, it's just people that aren't eating well at all. I do see some vitamin D deficiency, but I see that preoperatively too. So that's hard to say. But a lot of the vitamin deficiencies we see with gastric bypass patients, when we test the patients before they ever have surgery, they have these vitamin deficiencies already.
Mm-hmm. So Lynn wants to know, she's been on a low-fat, high-starch vegan diet, so whole food plant-based diet for years, and since switching's had very soft fingernails and soft tooth enamel. Anything that jumps to mind that could be missing?
I mean, I would get, if I was her, I'd get all her labs checked. So what are her iron levels? What is a vitamin D level? You could get problems with her nails with iron. And you can get iron deficiency with a vegan diet. It tends not to be as dramatic as people think. And usually the iron deficiency is not accompanied by an actual anemia. It's a slight iron deficiency, and it may be that a slight iron deficiency is actually good for you. We know certainly that heme iron that you would get from meat is not good for you. I would get all her labs checked. I would start with getting your zinc level checked, getting your iron level checked, getting your copper level checked. And I would make sure that you get a very varied diet, that you're getting fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, and seeds. And, if she's on a low-fat diet, I might add back some oil. I mean, some polyunsaturated fat, maybe a microalgae fish oil might help out in that situation. I have a lot of bariatric patients lose their hair after gastric bypass surgery. I have found that supplementation with omega-3, anecdotally, I haven't done a study on this, does seem to help out in that situation.
Gotcha. So Barry is coming back about the oils, wondering even if the mono and polyunsaturated oils have saturated fat in them.
Yeah, they do, but they're very low amounts. They tend not to raise the cholesterol the way a pure animal saturated fat would. I do worry about polyunsaturated fats in like fish oil supplements because they can oxidize so easily. Polyunsaturated fat is very unstable, and if it oxidizes, it's actually bad for you. But monounsaturated fats, the more I study it, they don't seem nearly as bad as I used to think they were. But again, it's person specific. In general, I try to avoid oils. To me, oil is a processed food, but I don't avoid avocados, nuts, seeds, and things like that.
Gotcha.
So if you're talking about oil that would be in a nut, I'm not that worried about it. If you're talking about oil, that's coming from a press and has been heated and things like that, yeah, I'm a little bit more concerned about it.
Gotcha. So I don't know if you see any more questions that we haven't answered. I don't see any new ones coming in.
You agree with Ray that type A personalities may find it easier to lose weight very fast rather than slow? Yeah, I do. There's I see certain people will come in. It's amazing to me because these really smart, really type A people coming in, morbidly obese, high cholesterol, hypertension, and how they didn't clue into diet and being fanatical about it beforehand. I don't know, but that was me too. Of course, high cholesterol, everything type A. But these people seem to throw themselves into the diet. They're the type A's are the people that are asking, well, how much oil? Do we really need oil? Maybe we shouldn't eat oil. I mean, these are the people that go, pretty fanatical about nutritarian. The one thing Ray brings up a lot, and I totally agree with, which is Joel Fuhrman's idea of a nutritarian diet, meaning it's not necessarily what you eat or what you don't eat. It's that every time you eat, you're trying to get high nutrient level food. And you're trying to eat the highest nutrients every time. And these type A personalities take it to the nth degree, right? They're having, a lot of fruit and all kinds of fruit. I mean, they're finding, all kinds of exotic fruits, noni berries and all kinds of stuff. They're eating not just salads, but kale and collards and mustards. And they go to the nth degree about this stuff. They're the ones jumping in the 75-degree pool. And yeah, they get like Penn Jillette has had incredible results. And he's obviously a type A, really, followed this to a T.
So Nate wants to know, is Dr. Davis rising MS3 here? How can I not be a useless sack of jelly on surgery rotation? So I think you need to translate that first.
MS3, I take it this is a third-level medical student going on to a surgery rotation. It's funny because when you're on your surgery rotation, boy, you eat like crap and you work really hard. The best thing in the world is to avoid those kind of comfort foods and foods that will tend to make you tired, which are the meats, the dairies, the donuts, the the bacons, and people tend to, when they're stressed and when they're at really tough times in life, tend to go back to those comfort foods, which is the exact wrong thing to do. At that point, you should be going to the foods that are most likely to help you in that situation, which are the fruits and the vegetables and the beans. It reminds me of that saying that they have with meditation, that you should meditate 20 minutes a day, and if you don't have any time, then you should meditate more. And I think that's the same with the fruits and vegetables. Eat lots of fruits and vegetables, and if you don't have any time, and if you're stressed, eat even more. And I think that would be the best way to get through those tough times.
Great. So there's a question, maybe about nightshades, the whole night vegetable avoidance, like Tom Brady. So nightshades?
I don't avoid nightshades at all. And in fact, I think if you're eating a generally anti-inflammatory diet, in other words, you have a diet that's very high in fruits and vegetables and beans, and you're getting all your nutrients, and you're exercising, and you're not eating a very high acidic diet, you're not going to get a lot of inflammation from nightshades. The only time I tell someone to avoid nightshades is if I've got a rheumatoid arthritis patient and I've got them on a plant-based diet and it hasn't completely cured their rheumatoid arthritis, because there's some great research on plant-based diets curing rheumatoid arthritis. Dr. McDougall's done a lot with that. In that situation, if I got someone who's struggling, even though they're on a plant-based diet, then we'll start to avoid nightshades. But in general, and for people that don't know, nightshades, like tomatoes are nightshade, potatoes are nightshade. And those, avoiding tomatoes, that's a great vegetable loaded with lycopene, which is fantastic for cancer. Which goes to the next question down there that says, any opinion about cooked versus raw? I think both are good. There are certain vegetables that are much better if they're cooked. It turns out tomatoes are actually better if they're cooked. You get more lycopene. You take something like spinach and you boil it and stuff like that, cook it, even when you steam it, not as much with steaming, but you do lose some of the nutrient value in that situation. But look, if you can't stomach it unless it's steamed or cooked, then eat it cooked. I wouldn't, the fried vegetables, tempura vegetables, probably not the best way to get your vegetables in. But I don't think you have to have a raw diet. And I kind of, there's this movement out there, raw before 4. That's fine. You should eat some raw fruits or vegetables. There's no doubt. There's nothing more nutrient packed than a raw fruit or vegetable. But at the same time, you could eat some cooked fruit and vegetables too. I think beans are unbelievably healthy for you, but you're not going to eat raw beans. You could sprout them, but cooked beans are normal.
Right. And I see this a lot in terms of question, that people are really looking for like that very, very fine distinction, when really what we just want to be talking about is the basic pattern of just like, eat more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, nuts and seeds, cut back or eliminate. Right? There's so much we're never going to know, because there's so few people doing it. It's always going to be anecdotal or benchtop studies. When you started out by getting your mind blown by the blue zones. I still think that, for most people, just understanding that is enough.
I totally agree. When you look at these blue zones, they're not on these. Look, the Okinawans, we trumpet them. We say, look at them for evidence of a plant-based diet, but they're not vegetarians or vegans. They're not extreme in any way, shape, or form. They do eat pork. They're not going to Gold's Gym. They're not doing CrossFit like I do. They're not running marathons. They're just, living a consistently balanced, healthy life. That's not to say don't be vegan, because, obviously I think, like we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, the more plants you eat, the better off you are. The less meat you eat, the better off you are. But if it's going to kill you if you don't have a little bit of chicken or meat once in a while, and you're doing this solely for health, you're not doing it for ethical reasons, then, it's not going to kill you.
Okay. So there's a comment that Michael Greger recently recommended your book. Fair to say you've made it?
Well, I love Dr. Greger, so if he recommends my book, then that's fantastic. I recommend his book and definitely his website. In the end, I will have made it when I see a shift in the plate of the American diet. To me, the thing that just kills me, and I gave this very impassioned speech last night at a board meeting for our hospital system about how absolutely ridiculous and unethical it is that we would feed carcinogenic food to our patients. And it was met with a really good response. And so I think times are changing. Things are getting better.
What do you think, Allison wants to know about the new meat made from plant heme by Impossible Foods? And I suppose others are working on the same thing. Supposed to be high.
Yeah, I don't know. There's first of all, there's Beyond Meat. There's this new cultured meat where they're actually using meat cells. I get the feeling that the cultured meat is going to end up having the same negative effects. So while it's great on the environment, it's great ethically because you're not killing animals. Animal protein is still high in the certain amino acids, like we talked about at the beginning of this talk, leucine. If you're culturing this meat, it's going to have high leucine. And we know that leucine activates mTOR. We know it's also going to activate IGF-1. We know that it's going to activate N-nitroso compounds. And so, that's not good. What about the plant-based protein stuff? Again, I don't like it when people go on plant-based diets, but yet still emphasize protein. However, as you know, Howard, and as we've researched, as I was looking at this stuff, I've never found a study showing anything negative about plant-based proteins. In other words, plant-based proteins don't seem to raise IGF-1, or if they do, for instance, soy will increase IGF-1, but it also increases IGF-1 binding protein. So the actual effective IGF-1 is not that high. It doesn't have a heme iron in it. It doesn't, when you grill vegetables, you don't get heterocyclic amines. And so I think plant-based meats are fine once in a while. I don't think they're something that should be the vast majority of your diet. I mean, I think I go and get a veggie burger from time to time. I tend to like the more homemade, natural quinoa and nuts and seeds and stuff that you could actually look at it and see than these processed pucks that you get. But yeah, I think it's okay once in a while. But again, the majority of the food you should eat in a day should be whole foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, seeds, and grains.
Right. So I saw a comment that passed by the ticker a while ago. Someone saying there's not enough recipes in the book. Where do you look for recipes, or where do you send people who say, okay, I want to try it, but I don't know where to start?
Right. So, well, I love Rich Roll's book, Plant Power Journey. Plant Power, I think it's called. Plant Power Way. Great recipes in that book. Engine 2 and Forks Over Knives have fantastic, and if you go to their websites, boy, there's a ton of recipes on those websites. And I think Engine 2 and Forks Over Knives are kind of working together a lot now, but I really like the Engine 2 recipes because they tend to be kind of simple. The original Engine 2 cookbook was really good because it was kind of geared, Rip was doing it geared to these firemen that he was working with, and it goes back to this. I tend to find that some men are really, it's hard to convince a man to get rid of his, steak and pizza and stuff like that. And so it had good, very fulfilling alternatives. I really love the recipes in Thug Kitchen's book, which is really hilarious book, if you don't mind curse words. So I'll use Thug Kitchen. Happy Herbivore has excellent recipes. Forks Over Knives, Engine 2 Diet, and then I love 21daykickstart.org and PCRM, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. If you go on their website, lots and lots of recipes.
Okay, excellent. Someone says, I do a ketosis diet. Any thoughts?
Ketosis is a stress response in the body. I mean, if you look at the high protein diet results, a lot of the studies, when you go and look at their at the patient's inflammatory mediators, they're higher. One diet was all excited because the ketosis diet had less of an effect on the metabolism, but they failed to mention that the cortisol levels increased and the C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory mediator, increased. The studies I've seen on the ketosis diet, there's some guys doing doing some really good work with the ketosis diet, Volek and Noakes. But again, we talked about this earlier, much of the stuff that they do is based on athletes. And number two, we're not getting really long-term studies here that are looking at the long-term effects on your heart, on your brain, on your kidney, on your muscle cells. And so I don't know what to think necessarily of a ketosis diet. It doesn't seem to me to be look, every single, and I'm telling 98% of the patients that come through this office, and I see thousands of patients a year, have been on a ketosis diet multiple times. So I just don't, in my patient population at least, I just don't see it being a very effective long-term solution. I used to put people on ketosis diets, and I saw very, very bad long-term results. So the short-term results are great because you go into ketosis, you're not as hungry, you don't eat as much. There's not a lot that you can eat because you can only eat, meats and, non-carbohydrate foods. And so you tend to, not be as hungry. You get nauseated. Your breath doesn't smell as good. You don't eat as much. You lose weight. Anytime you lose, it doesn't matter how you lose weight. Like the guy who lost weight on a Twinkie diet, but ate, less than 1,800 calories, and his cholesterol level get better. No matter what you do, if you lose weight, things are going to get better. Someone wrote down here, and it's true, the modern day ketogenic diets are relying a lot more on fat, and they're actually starting to stress less saturated fat. And so if you look at some of Volek's and notes, look, it's not the old Atkins, eat pork rinds and steaks all day long. They tend to be a lot higher fat and getting what's called fat adapted. And we need more studies on it. The studies are interesting to me, but they're way too short term. And a lot of the positive results to me are the patchwork. In other words, your A1C level improves because you're not eating sugar, but are you really not diabetic? And the answer to that's no. And in fact, they did that great study with those twin doctors on the BBC. I don't know if anybody saw that BBC video. One twin did a ketogenic diet, one twin did a low-fat diet, and the ketogenic twin had much worse glucose tolerance. And that's what I worry about with the long-term ketogenic diets.
Great. We did want to mention one thing. You're in a movie, right? That's coming out.
I am in a movie coming out,
and those folks are trying to raise funds to wrap it up and promote it. Can you talk a little bit about the movie and your experience with it? And
Egan did Cowspiracy. If you haven't seen Cowspiracy and are interested in, I got into plant-based diets because of health. It was 100% health in the beginning, but the more you get into it, the more you start. The more I read about plants for health, you got to get into plants for environment, and then you're like, oh my god, this works for the environment, and then you start getting into the ethics. These animals are being killed for what? And so I started getting into the environmental aspects of it, and Cowspiracy was just such a fantastic video to me. It was a really interesting study that they did, and just an interesting documentary. And now they're doing a documentary on not just plant-based eating, but on how could the medical establishment still, how is it that we're okay with you eating tons of meat, even though we know it's a carcinogen, and we'll give you statins when we know that we could get your cholesterol level down without statins, and we get your blood pressure down without blood pressure meds, and why isn't this stuff being told to people? And it's a really fascinating movie, and they're now doing an Indigo. If you go on my Facebook page, there's a link where you can actually support them, and they've got different levels of support where you can actually get, T-shirts. If you give a certain amount, you can have lunch with the producers, and so they're trying to raise money right now, and I think it's a really important cause because the more we get this word out there, the more people see this, the more they start making changes, the better off our world's going to be. The more people eat plants, the less we rely on meat, the less we're going to have environmental issues, from poisoning of our waters to global warming, etc. And the more the healthier we are as a nation, the richer we are, because we spend 16% of our GDP right now on health, which is outrageous. And yet we spend so much on our health, but yet we have one of the lowest longevities in the world. It's really a mystery to me that we haven't gotten more into this plant-based diet because it's such an answer to everything.
Right. So if folks are, valuing this blab and, we're donating our time, and if you want to give back, that's a good place to make a contribution to help this movie go out into the world. Because, Cowspiracy certainly was emotionally wrenching and great storytelling. And from the trailer, this new movie, What the Health, looks like it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be able to take the message that we saw in Forks Over Knives and Plant Pure Nation and kind of Hollywoodize it a little bit, which makes it, more palatable and to people who maybe aren't part of the movement.
Definitely.
So I got a couple more, and I'm cautious of your time because we've already gone over. How are you doing on time, Garth?
Yeah, I kind of got to get moving in a few minutes. Go and see some patients. But why don't we do 5 more? Let's do a couple more questions, and then why don't we could do this regularly? If people, was this helpful to people? Just give us a message. Yeah, this was helpful. But I'm getting some likes here, so I think that's great. Maybe we could do it, once a month or every few weeks, and answer questions. We try to get as many of your questions as possible. It's hard to keep up sometimes. I saw a question here in stressing a plant-based diet. Do you advocate all organic? When they've done the studies where they've looked at organic and they've looked at the actual vitamin content of organic food, there hasn't been a huge difference. The one thing that they find, obviously, is that organic foods have less pesticides on it. I do think there's a problem with consuming pesticides, which is why you see these people putting pesticides on and they're in hazmat suits. I tend to find also that organic grown food is going to make for better soil, which is better for the environment. And I do tend to emphasize organic food. I think it's important. Now, organic blueberries from Peru that have to travel, many days to get to you are probably not as healthy as a conventionally grown blueberry that you can get, immediately at a farmer's market. Most farmers markets tend to use organic techniques, though. But I, in my diet, and from what I have seen in the studies, I would tend to go with organic, although I think sometimes that organic name is starting to be overused nowadays. Just because it's organic, too, doesn't mean it's good. I mean, you can go to Whole Foods and you can buy organic vegan cookies, and, they're no better for you.
Right. And I remember, especially when you're talking about organic, the issue of animal foods becomes far more important, right? That even if you have an organic cow, even that cow has got like 70,000 times the concentration of these, persistent organic pollutants, even if it's organic. So if you're worried about organic, you should not be eating meat.
And high levels of estrogen. People are also, I love when people are so worried about soy having high levels of estrogen. It's ridiculous because the phytoestrogen in soy is a partial agonist antagonist. I mean, it kind of blocks the estrogen receptor and stimulates it, but very lightly. Chicken, steak, things like that, loaded with real estrogen. And so, yeah, it's crazy. I mean, definitely a grass-fed steak is better than a regular fed steak. And why is that? Because a grass-fed steak will tend to have higher omega-3 in it. But a grass-fed steak still has heterocyclic amines, still stimulates IGF-1, still has N-nitroso compounds, still has heme iron. Probably the best meat you could eat would be game food. You shoot a deer, it's going to be very low in saturated fats, low in the endotoxin, but it's still going to cause heterocyclic amines and all that kind of stuff. So game food is probably better, but I don't think you can beat a bowl of beans.
Gotcha. So let's end with this one. This would be a good sermon. I was very athletic up to college age, let myself go through my 20s, and I'm now in my mid-30s. If I go plant-based, can I reverse 15 years of damage?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, who knows? We haven't done that study, right? But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about. Look, I can't. I wish I could explain how different my health is now than it was 9 years ago. I mean, it's just a completely different world. And I swear, I don't think I ate a vegetable before I was 35 years old. I just can't possibly remember doing that. I ate steak and chicken and hamburgers constantly. I'd go to fast food restaurants. And so I did a lot of damage, and my cholesterol level was high, and I was hypertensive, and I had irritable bowel syndrome, and I felt like crap. And I feel like I've 100% reversed all of that with my current diet. I mean, I have constant energy, constantly feeling good. My cholesterol levels are normal. And I see it all the time in my patients. And so, yeah, I really think your body's very good. I mean, you got to remember, our cells are constantly replicating. We're constantly changing. And if you look at Esselstyn's and Ornish's work, you can reverse plaque in the heart, which I never thought you could do before, just by going on a diet. So, yeah, I think everything is reversible.
Right. In your story, you didn't even have like an athletic 20s, right? You started when you changed your diet. Now you're like ultra athlete.
My first, I would say, look, I'm still a surgeon, so I wouldn't say ultra athlete, but I'm very, I do something every day.
Well,
I do some
you took me running. You took me running. I'm still recovering. So let's put it that way.
Yeah. The first race I ever did was 39 years old. And I've done an Ironman, a half Ironman, and multiple other races. And I credit, obviously you could do it on meat diets because a lot of people do it, but I credit my turnaround with the plant-based diet.
All right. I think we've done enough for one day. So if you're willing to do this every month or so.
The technology is amazing. I can't believe this. This is very cool. I thank you guys all for your questions, and let's advertise it and do it again in a month, and maybe we can make this a regular thing, and hopefully we could answer a lot of these really good questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Garth. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.